Damon, just before the pandemic, you and me, I was in Cape Town and we went in your car, you're a great driver, and we went around the countryside to look at it. And it struck me that it'd be a land worth fighting for, that it was very beautiful, and that the whole idea of South Africa itself as contested territory has never gone away and will not go away in the immediate future. That the anti-apartheid movement, which was so outside South Africa, in a place like Ireland, was so idealistic, was so ready to believe that there would be a moment, an utterly transformative moment, when power would be handed from one side to another, which really would represent not only justice, but a sort of apotheosis of what freedom would mean. And it began with Mandela being released from prison, those extraordinary images of him coming out and being followed by these people, and his whole rhetoric, his tone was so controlled and so forgiving and so ready for the future. And there were other people reporting from South Africa, such as Nadine Gordimer, your colleague as a novelist. And Nadine Gordimer was filled with hope. You know, one of her books, her non-fiction books, was called Hope and History. And, you know, I suppose as a good Marxist, I mean, she really believed that this transformation would mean something. But of course, if it meant something, it would have to include the question, as we drove in that countryside, which was so beautiful. I mean, the way the light hit rock was just so exquisite. Who owns this? Who owns this field? Who owns that rock? Who owns that road? Who owns that house? The whole idea of ownership, that was the end of apartheid, going to mean a change of ownership. And this has been a burning question in Zimbabwe. You know, who should take land? Who has a right to land? What does ownership mean? And just if you could just take us through the importance of land and the sort of, in a way, how it's mystical, but it's also, of course, land. It also involves, you know, money. And if you could just take us through what this means in what we might call the new South Africa.
I'd love to be able to take you through that, but it's the hugest question at the moment. I mean, there's no way to cover all of it. I mean, I would say that's essentially, in many ways, South Africa's burning problems are all centered in the fact that we are still a frontier society. You know, there are lots of countries that have emerged from colonialism and that have, you know, solidified into being something else, and the memories of, you know, the contestation of land are so far back that actually, you know, those are edges with no bite anymore. But that's not the case in South Africa. You know, to quote William Faulkner, you know, the past isn't past yet. So there is a sense in South Africa that you get, I would imagine, in many frontier societies from, you know, early colonies, where everything is up for contestation, and laws are a nice idea, but they don't really have a grip. And South Africa feels very much like that to me. I mean, there's a sense of, you know, we have a fabulous constitution, we have fabulous laws. They're hardly ever applied, and very few people bother following them most of the time. So there is the feeling that, you know, things are being kind of made up as we go along. As for land, you know, I mean, we all partook of this dream that you articulated, that in fact we were about to, you know, in '94, rewrite the future. But there was a great naivety to that, which partly comes out of the fact that in all the years I was growing up, South Africa was unnatural in the sense that there was never a change of political party. Everything was locked into place. No ideas were coming in from outside because of the boycott. So everything was a kind of a test tube. And when all that changed, we had this naive idea that, oh, we're joining the nations again, and the greater world is going to flood in. And of course, that's not how politics works. It's not how history works. And we've had a brutal education in how politics and history work. And right at the center of politics right now in South Africa is the question of land. And, you know, you talk about Mandela and his stateliness, his his quality as a statesman, all of which is true, except that in the eyes of many young South Africans, he's no longer a hero. He's seen as someone who sold out, and precisely over the issue of land and who owns it. I mean, I think it's an open secret that political power was handed over in South Africa, but economic power was not. And effectively, that has kept everybody more or less where they were. So it's become an absolutely gnawing question. Land, I think, stands in for a lot of other things. So when people say we want our land back, what they're actually saying is we want power. We want to be the people in the driving seat here. And in fact, the people in the driving seat tend more or less to be the old people, because if you are in control of the economy, really you're in control of everything. So that's a winding and inadequate answer, but it does sort of perhaps give a partial picture.
I wonder if it's possible that, like a lot of novelists, maybe you're not unique in this, but that there are two sides to you, one in which can talk in this way about what's going on publicly in your country, but really as a novelist, your interests are in privacy, in the intimate moment, in what happens to individuals, rather than writing sweeping accounts of changes in a society. So that one of the things I think I'd like people to know about you is that this idea of living in beauty still matters to you. In other words, if you could tell us what you do once a week, or is it once a month, or is it once a day? But if you could just, because I think that's an important element in trying to describe how your imagination works. If you could just tell us, I mean, this is nothing scandalous, by the way. It's really, but if you could just give us an account of what that journey is.
Colm is referring to the fact that I climb Table Mountain once a week.
Could you just tell us what Table Mountain is, just for?
Cape Town's rare in that it's a city that's built around a mountain. I mean, the city effectively wraps around Table Mountain, and if you climb the mountain, which is easy to do actually for almost anyone who lives in the city who can reach it, in a very short space of time, there's no sense at all that you're in the center of a city. I mean, you're firstly enclosed by forest, and then you get up to the top of the mountain, and there many places from which you cannot see the city or hear it. You have the sea and great silence and light, and you have the sense that you're in the middle of great emptiness and great space. So it was Colm's suggestion when I told him this, that I should write up my once weekly ascents of the mountain in some form of diary.
I mean, I would read it. What it's like every week, and the different light and the different thoughts are coming into your mind. And
sure.
I mean,
if I send you, a few notes, would you write it for me?
You were talking about the boycott of that thing. Even books had not for sale in South Africa on them. Well, I'm wondering, you and me, we both come from small countries. I mean, small countries in terms of power, or economic power, even cultural power. That if you are reading, if you start as a teenager and books become your thing in Ireland or South Africa, it doesn't mean that it's almost that you don't confine yourself to reading the Irish writers or the South African writers. Somehow or other, the country has annoyed you enough or repressed you enough without having to read about rain or Catholicism or whatever your particular South African province were, which meant that left you open to the outside world in a way that maybe didn't happen with English writers or American writers, where you could decide to really take on Virginia Woolf and to make her yours in a very special way because it was private. And with Faulkner, say, that actually find Faulkner. And the fact that he was American didn't bother you. The fact that he was Faulkner was what interested you. And so the reading became, first of all, a way to survive, but secondly, a way where the outside world came in a very intense, private way into your life as a reader, and then even as a citizen. That idea of that you could read anything you wanted.
Sure, and it effectively opened the world to you, or opened you to the world. I mean, it gave me ideas and brought me in touch with ways of thinking that were really not available close to home, not at all. I mean, South Africa was a very stifled and stifling environment to grow up in. I mean, books, amongst other things, teach you that the world is not made in your own image, which is why you can usually tell quite quickly who's a reader and who isn't. And it's incidentally one of the, we had a very, very strong economic boycott of South Africa, and it's effectively that which brought apartheid down. But part of the boycott was also a cultural boycott. So, a lot of books, as you pointed out, couldn't come to South Africa. A lot of plays could not be performed there, movies and so on. And I've never been sure how I felt about that, because and it's relevant now because I'm hearing that a similar thing is being applied to Russia right now around the Ukraine thing, that publishers are being told to cut deals with Russia, that books should not be published there, and so on. It seems to me that if you want to change people's minds, why cut off the flow of ideas? So I'm not sure about that aspect of the boycott, but that's a side note.
Okay. Just before we start talking about the promise, could you read us, just so we get a sense of the sound of the book?
I could. I'm going to take a little reading from fairly early on when Amor, who's the youngest daughter in this family, has come home because her mother has died. And she sees the crowd of people in the house and she doesn't want to be with them. So she goes up a little hill behind the house and she's looking down on it. While she's there, the child of the woman, Salome, who works for their family, a black woman who's been working for their family for years and years, comes climbing up the hill from the other side. A human figure approaching, filling itself in slowly, putting on age and sex and race like items of clothing, till she's looking at a black boy, also 13 years old, wearing ragged shorts and t-shirt, broken tackies on his feet. Sweat sticks cloth on skin. Pull it loose with your fingers. Hello, Lucas, she says. How's it, Amor? First, it is necessary to beat the earth with a stick. Then he settles himself on a rock. Easy to speak to each other. Not the first time they've met up here. Children still on the verge of not being children anymore. I'm sorry about your mommy, he says. She nearly cries again, but doesn't. It's all right when he says it, because Lucas's father died too, on a gold mine near Johannesburg when he was only little. Something joins them together. What she just remembered spills over. She wants to tell him about it. It's yours now, the house, she says. He looks at her, not understanding. My mother told my father to give it to your mother. A Christian never goes back on his word. He looks down the hill to the other side where he lives, in the crooked little house, the Lombard place. That's what everyone calls it, even though old Mrs. Lombard died years ago, before Amor's grandfather bought it to stop that Indian family moving in and let Salome live there instead. Some names stick, some don't. Our house. It'll be yours now. He blinks, still confused. It's always been his house. He was born there. He sleeps there. What is the white girl talking about? Growing bored, he spits and stands up. She notices how long and strong his legs have become, the wiry hairs growing on his thighs. She can smell him too, the stink of sweat. All this is new, or maybe the noticing is new, and she's embarrassed already, even before she's aware he's looking at her. What? She says, huddling over, arms on her knees. Nothing? He jumps over to her rock, crouches down next to her. His bare leg is close to hers. She can feel the warmth and prickle. She jerks her knee away. Ugh, she says, you need to wash. He gets up quickly and leaps back to the other rock. Now she feels sorry for chasing him away, but doesn't know what to say. He picks up his stick and hits with it again. All right, he says. Okay. He walks back down the hill the same way he came up, slashing with a stick at the white tops of the grass, pushing it into termite hills, letting the world know he's there. She watches him till he disappears, feeling lighter now because the big black car is gone, and a big blackness that was sitting on her has gone too. Then she wanders down the other side of the kopje, pausing here and there to look at a rock or a leaf, to her own house, or the house she thinks of as her own. By the time she comes in through the back door, 133 minutes and 22 seconds have passed since she ran away. 4 cars, including the long dark one, have departed. A single new one has arrived. The telephone has rung 18 times, the doorbell twice. On one occasion, because somebody has sent flowers that improbably turn up all the way out here. 22 cups of tea, 6 mugs of coffee, 3 glasses of cool drink, and 6 brandy and cokes are being consumed. The 3 toilets downstairs, unused to such traffic, have between them flushed 27 times, carrying away 9.8 litres of urine, 5.2 litres of shit, 1 stomachful of regurgitated food, and 5 millilitres of sperm. Numbers go on, but what does mathematics help? In any human life, there's really only one of everything. I'll leave it there.
Thank you for that. Now, there are 2 questions arising from that. The first is, what is the promise?
The promise is something that Amor, this young daughter, believes she's overheard. Her mother on her deathbed asking her father that he would agree to give this broken down house on a scrappy piece of land to Salome, who's this black woman who's been working for their family for years and years and looked after Amor's mother through her last illness. And she hears, or believes she hears, her father agree that he will do that and promise that he will. But of course, in time-honored South African tradition, he and the rest of the family spend many, many years dancing around this question and finding ways not to follow through. And really that is part of what gives the story its arc, the many, many years of not acting on the promise.
I think there are 2 other arcs of the story. One really gives me my second question arising from that, which is that you do something strange in the book with where you interject, or you actually get this sort of naturalistic narrative. In other words, she went there, she thought that, he did that, he moved there, and you move into some other realm where it's the novelist coming in, or it's some sort of narrator coming in, as in the numbers game you did there. And that this is one of the features of the novel, which I think has excited everybody, because there's sort of open space in a narrative like this. It's not exactly, it's an intervention, but it's subtle. In other words, you follow it, it holds you. It requires an awful lot of tact. I was going to say, if I've embarrassed you, but I'll say it, an awful lot of talent to get that right. In other words, so I want to know first, did it come in an early draft? Did you add it later? Did you cut it sometimes? Did you add it sometimes? What are your manuscripts like?
They're a mess. They're an absolute mess. I work by hand, and I like the mess, because I'm the only person who knows how it all fits together. I did embark on this book in a far more conventional way. I don't want to sort of bang on about it too long, but it seems to me that when books first developed, in fact, before books, I guess, back in Homer's time, when we were talking about an oral tradition, there was an acknowledgement of the fact that this is a story being told to you by somebody. And then, novels sort of adopted this approach. I mean, the dear reader, I'm about, and then the narrator would, move out of the way, and you'd get to the actual story. But then, as novels developed further, it became the convention, and it still mostly is, that you try to keep, if you're writing in the third person, you try to keep your narrator off stage, as it were. You want to receive the story through a clear pane of glass. You don't want to be reminded of the mechanics. And this kind of bothers me, because I know a lot of writers aren't bothered by it. It's what you do, but it's always kind of eaten at me that writing stories is a form of lying. Once upon a time in a faraway land there was a princess in a tower. Nonsense. There was no faraway land. There was no princess. There was no tower. But your skill as a novelist will be judged precisely by how persuasively you tell that lie. So, you have to introduce details or conjure sensations that give the reader the impression that this is something unfolding in front of them. And of course, there's great artistry in that, and of course, I strive to do that. But all the time, I'm aware that storytelling is an artificial exercise. Anyway, it so happened that, I did begin writing in this more conventional way, but I was offered the chance to do a couple of drafts of a film script on the side, and I took it. And when I returned to my novel, in a kind of fury, because I'd just had a fight with the director, in the state of rage, I sort of...
So when you say film script, you actually were doing the entire business of, in brackets, the way a film script has to tell you not only what they're saying, but has to tell you what movements they're making.
Exactly.
So you did all that for the script?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, you do. And it involves visualizing what the camera is going to be seeing at any moment. So effectively, I'd sort of taken into myself the language of very fast cutting from one point of view to another. And when I came back to this, I thought, well, that might work with prose. So I started to play with it. But the trouble is you can't do that very fast change of point of view and sometimes location without drawing attention to the fact that this is being told to you by somebody, and this somebody is, kind of moving you very, very fast. So I thought, instead of trying to conceal the narrator, let me move in the other direction and draw attention to the fact that the story is being told. And effectively what it did was to fracture the narrative into multiple points of view, and allow the narration to be taken over at certain moments by particular characters. Sometimes the narrative sort of lapses into somebody's head, and then it becomes a first-person narration.
You mean that just there, Amor and Lucas can both, in the same scene, have perspectives?
Well,
Is
yes,
that right?
but although that would probably be part of a conventional narrative approach anyway, you would be allowed to talk about what they. But what you wouldn't do normally, I think, is it didn't really feature in that passage. But if you come so close to a particular character that their gravity almost pulls you in, I let the narrative then become a first-person narrative. So very often you're suddenly getting, I did this, or I felt that, or other thing, and then pull away from that again. But the opposite of that is that moment in the end where we get all the mathematics. Effectively, in cinematic terms, that's like pulling back to a very wide shot where the human figures are very, very tiny. And there's great coldness in that, as opposed to the first-person voice, which is always warm. But I like the range that it established.
And I suppose, again, two questions. One, did that get added to a manuscript, or as you were working, did that organically come each time you felt it was needed? You put it in, say, in the first draft?
Yeah, I don't think you could mechanically add it after the fact. You have to feel those moments. So the moments where I felt for want of a better word, the humanity of a character that I was describing, that would sort of pull me into a first-person voice. And then at other moments where I kind of wanted to distance myself from whatever was happening, it would become much, much colder. I mean, so cold in some instances that at least one of my editors said to me he thought there was real cruelty in the book, and I'm not going to deny that, because a sort of godlike, distant view is always going to be cruel. Humans always look.
I think cruel is a bit strong, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe, but cold, I would say. So I don't mind the fact that the range of the book, extends from warm to cold.
I saw it as a sort of excitement that you're working in this very close way with character, motives, how someone is thinking, what someone is doing, and then you allow that to sort of, I suppose, to that you riff on it, or you allow it to dissolve slightly when another tone takes over, as something could in music.
Yeah.
But it didn't worry me about whether it was cruel or cold. It worried me sometimes that I was watching it technically was so astonishing, because you were really pushing the limits of, it's like the fourth wall. It's like an actor deciding actually to talk to the audience in the middle of a scene.
Right.
And what I'm asking you, I suppose, about is, it's a question of judgment, isn't it? It's a question of knowing when you can do it. And I'm wondering whether times when you said, no, it has to go here, or I have to add it. I keep wondering if it came naturally all the time, or if you saw ways it could be added. I'm back with that question, but I suppose I'm asking it now. Did you ever delete it?
Mostly, look, you cannot take any mode of approach that doesn't in some way fit with your own sensibility, right? So from early on, my feeling was, this speaks for me. Instinctively, I know how to play this piece. And I went with that. But of course, there are still tricky technical bits. I mean, what I found difficult were transitions, actually, which are generally difficult. But I guess in a more conventional approach, you leave those nice little page breaks and jump to a whole new section. But with this, I wanted the forward momentum that a film has. A movie doesn't stop. It cuts, but it doesn't stop. You're still in the forward flow. So here, that was a transition. That the mathematics of that. So
you could move to something else after it.
Yeah.
And were there writers? You mentioned to me that you'd been paying a lot of attention to Virginia Woolf at the time of writing this book. I just wonder if you could just talk about that.
In fact,
I mean, I'm not asking you, did she influence you, but just what did it mean to read her just now as you were working in that way?
Well, in fact, I only discovered Virginia Woolf for the first time, I mean, to my embarrassment, while I was working on this. In fact, a friend of mine who you met when you were in South Africa, Mark, is a big devotee of Virginia Woolf, and I was talking about the book and what I was doing, and he said, "Oh, but Virginia Woolf, you must." And I turned to her, and indeed, she was the right voice for the time. So,
what books in particular? What?
Well, the Waves, Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, the major ones, I guess. But the kind of reigning spirit of the book was probably Faulkner more than anybody else. I mean, he was someone I read a lot of when I was much younger. But for me, Faulkner's zone of strength was voice and multiple voices. So, that clearly has play here, whereas Virginia Woolf's field was far more time, I think. And the passage of time and what it does and so on, which is a kind of a slower alchemy. So she was a presence in the writing of the book, but not an influence, I guess, whereas Faulkner probably was.
It seems to be astonishing that his novel, As I Lay Dying, it isn't often mentioned as one of his best-known books. We go to Absalom, or The Sound and the Fury, but I think it's had an extraordinary influence on novelists. That this is, as most of you know, this is really multiple voices brought to an extraordinary level, and the way in which each one has a different tone, and also the project. I mean, the action is moving onwards with the voice each time, and you get an extraordinary sense of a cacophony and excitement around voice, but also the sort of melancholy of what they're all doing, and the fact that the sort of gothic things that occur to them all along the way. It seems to me it's a blueprint, if you're a novelist, for what can be done.
Yeah, I mean, that was my sense reading it of what became possible, and his willingness to break the form and make new forms. It's emboldening if you read them. That you touch on something which is with cinema, of course, you can cut. You can cut from one point of view to another, but you're bound by physical space because the camera has to be somewhere. Whereas novels do something different, and they have the power to travel into people, into people's minds. So the language was much broader. If you can cut from somebody's inner thoughts, inner life, to somebody else's inner life, you're effectively setting in one emotional terrain against another. So that cut is much richer than a cinematic cut might be, I think.
You then have to structure the book as to how are you going to deal with this promise over time, and the way you do it is you pick on death, and you say around each death, as the generations disappear, around each death will be drama, around each death will be the scene set, so that these are the big moments. I'm interested in this because you make these moments really intimate. you know, it's really about how people behave with their families in a time of crisis, about coming back to a certain house whose rooms are familiar and not familiar. That you know, it's a public novel in certain ways, but in other ways, it's a very private book about a family. And you're very careful, I think, not to make the family, you know, a metaphor, or not to have them symbolically representing the South African family. They sort of represent themselves. And they do so in great detail at certain times. But I think the structure is vital for this, where it's structured around deaths and funerals and the sort of rituals around grief and burial, and you know, which seems to me just a really ingenious way of handling the sweep of time you're dealing with, that you actually have a way in to each period that is intimate as much. I mean, before it's public or metaphorical, it's intimate.
Yeah. You know, when I was younger, to get an idea for a novel, it usually meant something related to plot. You know, I have the story. As I get older, I'm far more drawn to the structure, the way of telling a story, and it was that you know first excited me about this. You know, it came from an anecdote, a friend, or a series of anecdotes. A friend was telling me about family funerals he'd been to, and then I thought, well, you know, I had been wanting to write a story, a family story, and I've read lots of family stories, and I didn't really want to tread a familiar path, but it occurred to me that I had not read another book. I mean, there may be one out there, but I had not read one that took this particular narrative approach.
Yeah, that's correct.
And I like the panels, you know, that everything's concentrated into a few days here, and that the next panel you see is in a different decade. And there's a whole lot of stuff that's right off the map there that's not really sort of gone into, but a whole lot is transformed, you know, for individuals and for the family, but also nationally. You know, in the background you're seeing this country is making big changes, or, you know, I'd like to say progressing, but it's not necessarily an upward journey.
Yeah, but it feels like, I mean that's there in the book, where these intimate lives, or these intimately described lives, are being lived to a backdrop of enormous change, changes that can be registered really easily by the Mandela or the end of apartheid, etc. But I think you're careful to actually, when you do this in the book, it's done in a very intimate way, because Salome, to whom the promise is made, it isn't as though she's a revolutionary figure or an outspoken figure. She's someone who's ready to be grateful if this bit of land could be given to her. In other words, she is complicit, she is easy. But her son, who it gets mentioned here early in the book, by the end of the book, is not only angry, but you can see that there's a radicalization has occurred in his political consciousness that is going to have enormous implications for the future. In other words, he's saying, give us your land. It was, you know, don't be foolish. It was never, you know, it was never your land.
Yes.
That sort of mystical idea, the land, it doesn't matter who signed for it, it's ours.
Yeah.
And we're going to take it.
Yeah.
So that you actually have a character who's a side character in the book to some extent, but by the end of the book you realize actually perhaps he's the central figure all along. His movement, which I think is organic in the book. It's not as though, you know, he's not as though you're mentioning the books he was reading or the speeches he was listening to. It happens to him because of who he is, and that next generation just what, you know. But I mean, what you make it personal. You make it intimate. You make it part of the family, his radicalization.
Sure. The same friend, incidentally, who told me about the funerals and gave me the idea, made a casual remark just before I came over. He said, well, you know, I saw these two little schoolboys, I mean, very small, a black boy and a white boy walking down the road to school this morning. They were holding hands and they looked very happy. And he said, I just thought, those two boys, if nobody ever told them anything about history, they would be fine. And there is the sense that this is a totally innocent encounter, Amor and Lucas on the hill, but you know, by the time we see him at the end, history has happened to him. There is no such thing as a life free of history. And what it does is transform their relationship utterly. He will not even say her name. And that is not untrue of where we are in South Africa right now. I mean, I don't know how much of this news reaches here, but there has been a whole kind of radical upwelling amongst a generation that was really born after apartheid. That's now, they've reached student level at university of roads must fall and fees must fall, and it's driven by enormous rage. And effectively the rage is about the fact that here we are 27 years after, the end of apartheid, and what has changed? We're still sitting with the same situation. So the rage is about move on, let's move ourselves to a new. So Lucas is part of that, and that voice of anger, which is, he basically says to her, you think you can give us this broken down house as a favor. You can't give us anything because we own it already. You took it from us, but it is ours. Mm-hmm. And yeah,
there were two things I saw when I was there, which really surprised me. One was there was a big tennis match that everyone was very excited about, and it was Nadal versus Federer. I mean, you can't do better than this. And so you go to it in all innocence, want to watch the tennis, and then you look around and you see that every single person is white in. Among the spectators, that you are in an all-white zone in this, because I was so moved by the anti-apartheid movement. And here I was in South Africa. I thought, surely my eyes are telling me wrong. And the other thing was the annual budget was being presented in Parliament, and F.W. de Klerk just wanted to come and sit in the Distinguished Visitors Gallery as an ex-politician, as someone who had, I suppose, done good in this society. And there was a radical group in the Parliament who wanted him removed. Yeah. That he was a white man, and he was far too much implicated in apartheid, and he should go. And I noticed how angry they were, but also how, not just articulate, but there was an agenda, and they also had quite a number in Parliament. This particular group.
Yeah.
So it's
the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters. Land is their slogan, basically, and they want the land. Their program essentially is that all land ownership will be neutralized. It will be taken by the state, and you will lease whatever property you want from the state, which, in its way, I think if they ever came to power, it would be economically disastrous for the country. But it is a vision that would put us all on an equal footing. And there is no other competitive vision out there to do that. Yeah. There is that. With regard to that tennis match, it sort of relates to the very first point we talked about earlier, which is that, it's not that black people wouldn't have wanted to be there, it's that most black people cannot afford it. So economically, people are trapped exactly where they were under apartheid, and that cuts across a whole range of things. Most black people in South Africa cannot afford to buy a novel. They're prohibitively expensive. The state has done nothing to make them available, although it pays lip service to the notion of, literacy and creating a reading culture and so on. But, so many doors are closed, so many thresholds cannot be crossed because you simply do not have the means. So it's all very well to have, great laws that make everything, equally available to everyone. But if you don't have the means to access these things, nothing has changed for you.
As a novelist, then, with a novel like The Good Doctor, or the novel that folled, The Imposter. In a Strange Room.
Yes, sorry.
There is really almost a wall around private life. It is as though you're desperate to hold on to the idea that a novel can still write about someone whose concerns are private and intimate. And that in this book, it is as though those walls have opened, and that something that was boiling in you, that you were attempting to turn the heat down on, which was to write a novel which had immense public implications, that has been caused. It's what Auden said about Yeats, Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. And Mad South Africa, or at least divided South Africa, hurt you into writing The Promise.
Well, I guess this is my South African novel, and part of the satisfaction of writing with these multiple voices as a chorus is that South Africa is a country that can only speak as a discordant chorus. I mean, there's something innately wrong with one voice narrating South Africa's story in any shape or form. It's not a land that can tell its tale in that way. In another sense, though, the real subject, I need a buried subject, a secret subject for every book, which is one known only to me in a sense, but I'm going to just don't tell anyone. For me, it's time and the passage of time, which of course, the jumps in time of the book and so on, but in an almost DNA coded way in the book, I like to think if you see the story as just one strand in the bigger tapestry of time, all the arbitrary side characters that come in, who would usually be given a kind of marginal status, a little detail here and there, each of them seems to take a center stage just for a second. And what I'm trying to do is illuminate the fact that this is just one possible story, and this, overlapping, again, tapestry, multiple strands overlapping, and that one could just as easily have gone off sideways with one of these other story strands and left this family behind. The only thing that really renders them as the main characters in the book is the fact that, the narrative keeps drifting back to them. But, sorry, that's a slightly woolly answer to your question.
No, it's good. Yeah. Could you read us another section of the book?
I could. This section relates to the house, the large house where it begins there anyway. The house is empty at this moment. It's been deserted for a couple of hours, apparently inert, but making tiny movements, sunlight stalking through those rooms, wind rattling the doors, expanding here, contracting there, giving off little pops and creaks and burps like any old body. It seems alive, an illusion common to many buildings, or perhaps to how people see them, filled with mood and expression, windows like eyes. But nobody is here to witness it. Nothing stirs, except for the dog in the driveway, leisurely licking his testicles. Not even Salome is around, as she normally would be. You might have expected to see her at the funeral, but Tannie Marina told her in no uncertain terms that she would not be allowed to attend. Why not? Don't be stupid. So Salome has gone back to her own house instead, to the Lombard place, and changed into her church clothes, which she would have worn to the service. A dark dress, parched and darned, and a black shawl, and her only good pair of shoes, and a handbag and hat. And like that, she sits out in front of her house, the Lombard place, on a second-hand armchair from which the stuffing is bursting out, and says a prayer for Rachel. Oh God, I hope you can hear me. It is me, Salome. Please welcome the madam where you are and look after her carefully, because I wish to see her again one day in heaven. I've known her a long time, from before she was a madam, even from when she and I both were young women, and in these past days we were sometimes one person. I'm sure you understand, because it was you who gave this great suffering to her so that I could look after her. For that she promised this house to me, and for that I thank you. Amen. Perhaps she doesn't pray in these words, or in any words at all. Many prayers are uttered without language, and they rise like all the rest. Or perhaps she prays for other things, because prayers are secret in the end and not all to the same God. But in any case, after some time has passed, which is certainly true, see how the shadow of the anthill has moved, for the sun is no longer at its highest point, she gets up, slow and stiff from the chair, and goes back inside. When she emerges again after another unmeasured interval, she's wearing her usual clothes, her ragged dress and slip-slops, a cloth tied over her hair, and she sets off along the footpath around the kopje. I'll leave it there again.
Thank you very much. The question of class, that would it have been tempting, or certainly for another novelist who might have been tempting, to have made the white people posh, to have given them big houses, gated, gates, guards, gold, dogs, elaborate systems of wealth that they had been accumulating over generations, that they were guarding against the hordes outside. And so that you would have a sort of lovely drama between, the very rich and the very poor, and the promise made and the promise broken. And it would be very easy to see what should happen, and you emphatically don't do that. You give us these white people who are struggling.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, but I guess I see the rich as kind of generic. They could almost be anywhere, whereas people who are struggling tend to be more idiosyncratically stamped with their place and their past.
That's a great answer. So you mean that if you just got rich people, you could do nothing much with them other than make them rich, and everything they do would be rich and rich and rich. Whereas if you get someone who's trying to be a nurse, or someone who's trying to deal with service, that the very ways in which they do this give them sort of an individuality that you can then dramatize and work with.
Well, exactly. But my own background isn't especially rich. I mean, I'm very well off in relation to most, poor South Africans. But my own family background is sort of, lower middle class, really. But it's also, you can say far more about what's authentically South African if you're writing in that sort of zone, I think. Whereas, I don't know, rich people, they may be on the Riviera, they may be in Johannesburg, but, richness tends to put a veneer of, I don't know, cosmopolitan neutrality over everything, or at least it does in my mind. Yeah. And also, I quite like the fact that what's at stake here is a crappy house and a useless piece of land. It's not something incredibly valuable, yet it's so important.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful image, that it's not as though it's a vast estate that will bring in a lot of money. It's something small but will really matter enormously to the people involved, which gives you a sense of the levels of poverty and the levels of need. We're going to move to questions from the audience, which I was told would happen when the lights came up, and then they did, so thank you. And so if someone could please quickly come up to the microphone, that would really help us all.
And you can go right up to the microphone and ask a question, and then form a line down the aisle to ask questions.
Please now.
Colm needs you because he doesn't want to talk to me anymore.
No, but I'm absolutely ready to talk to you more, but I mean, there's often just this embarrassed moment. Oh, great, we have it. Great, thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you both what advice you might have for aspiring writers, just starting out.
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you.
Oh, I just wanted to ask what advice you might have for aspiring writers who are just starting out. Thank you.
Save yourself before it's too late. It's very hard to just dole out advice because everyone's issue with writing tends to be different. So really, without knowing what you're struggling with, it's hard to respond. Although, Colm probably has the solution for you, whatever it might be.
Don't start. I suppose that there are a number of things that there seems to be a DNA that makes some writers be playwrights, others be poets, others be short story writers, and others be novelists. And you really can't judge when you're starting what you are. And often you're doing completely the wrong thing, and it's very hard for someone else to say to you, if you became a screenwriter, all the things you're good at would emerge. Or, I'm sorry, bad news for you, but you're a poet. And, but it is an odd business that this thing you are forms in you in a way that you can't control and you really can't do anything about. And I suppose the second thing is that if you finish everything you start, that might seem like a very little thing, but what happens, I don't know if it ever happens to you, but halfway through a book, you could feel, well, I know the rest of the book. Milton must have felt that with Paradise Lost. I mean, I know the story. Therefore, what's in it for me? And the answer is, of course, this is a form of communication, that you're involved not in exploring something you need to explore, but in communicating something that you have explored, however tentatively, and that therefore you're writing for a reader. So that your novel is not just got characters in it, but it's got a reader outside it, that even if the reader's in the future, you have to always be alert to at what point do I have to remember does the reader know enough now, know too much now? You have to judge the reader as though the reader was someone you knew and were almost speaking to. So you're back actually with the sort of oral idea of a storyteller around a fire knows by the response of the audience how much detail he or she can go into. And so too, as a novelist, even though there's no one around the fire, you have to imagine them there. And you also have to always be aware that this is a form of work and it's a form of communication. And that inspiration, the business of just getting a melody or a rhythm for a novel, I don't know if you agree with this, but it comes once. In other words, you get a sound for the novel, or you get something you can start with. But don't look for that again, because what you need to do now is finish your book. Finish your book, finish your book, finish your book. And if anyone asks you what you're doing, I'm finishing my book. And if anyone says to you, is there someone waiting for your book? Which, is often a problem. Somebody you're writing it and think, who? And you think, well, yes, the people I'm writing it for are waiting for it. It's an important thing, this book. And, I'm not going out with you this weekend. I'm writing my book. That might be the most important thing. How you control your weekend as a writer is actually whether you get to finish the book or have a half-written book. But it's also lovely to say to people, no, I'm not going to anything, I'm writing my book. And people think, oh, she's writing her book. Anyway, that's just my begin. I could go on, but I just start with that idea of, well, that's. Do you agree with any of this? You're sitting there grinning.
I'm fascinated. Particularly by the idea that nobody pointed out to me I might be in the wrong branch of writing all this time.
Yes, but it happens on its own. I
know.
You do drift into it, and you do find out by a certain age.
Sure.
That,
I once thought I wanted to be a playwright and then discovered that wasn't the case. But see, I knew he was the person to ask.
Damon, you've spoken very beautifully about writing about South Africa, writing in South Africa, but this year, writers from the African continent have sort of swept most of the international literary prizes, and I'm wondering if you might speak a little bit to this moment in writing in Africa. What does it mean for writers in Africa? Why do you think there's been this extraordinary success this year?
Yeah, it is very noticeable that this happened. But it's very hard to know what it signifies. I would like to think that it means there's been a kind of sea change in perception around African writing, and that perhaps publishing outside Africa is going to suddenly be more receptive to stories from Africa. But I don't know that that's true. I made a point of it at the Booker thing because my feeling was that even if this isn't a significant moment, that if we focus on it in the right way, we could turn it into a significant moment. And the significance, I would hope, doesn't extend just to the West, because I don't think it should be the obligation of Europe or North America to publish African writers. I would sort of hope that African countries start to take their own stories and publishing far more seriously too. And that, in a funny way, may be a far harder task than persuading Western publishers to regard African novels or stories in a different sort of way. There's enormous indifference, which is far more powerful in a way than prejudice against the notion of African stories. Indifference from within can kill anything. I could go on about it, but I won't. The Department of Arts and Culture in South Africa is the joke ministry in government. It's where they put people when they want to punish them. I have no notion of any program that department is running. They receive large amounts of money you would think as someone in the arts that I would know what their projects are. I have no clue. As far as I know, they're in a profound sleep. And I think that's true for most African countries. So if you want to be a writer in Africa, you are really pushing against the current, especially if you come from a disadvantaged background and you don't have the usual resources, even just contacts. So I would really hope that turning up the dial attention-wise on African writing is going to change the game a little bit. But it's always been a slow game, and it probably will be for quite a while yet. I can't answer you more fully than that, but I have hopes. You might have to talk to me again, Colm.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's happened is the way in which, for example, there was a thriving publishing industry in Argentina. So Borges had a local publisher when he started. So did Bioy Casares. So did the famous writers from Argentina now. They had places to work with in their own city, in their own country, editors to work with, magazines to work from. But where are those publishers now? They were all bought by multinationals. And what they did was this is a very serious matter, because they didn't just buy the publishing houses and close them, which is what they did do, and get the rights to the writers. But so everything is printed in Spain, everything is edited in Spain, and then it's sent back to the South American countries from Spain. And they're now saying to South American writers, some of your language is so, your dialogue is so local that Spanish readers can't understand it. So we want to sort of standardize something that should be part of the variousness of the way different countries use language. And so in Spanish, it's a really serious matter. And but it would be a wonderful idea if Nigeria, for example, which sort of has a growing literacy and a growing seriousness about writing, could actually really, there is one country you feel that could pioneer this and create a publishing industry of its own, a distribution system, editing system, and it would change. I feel it would change the country.
Yeah.
If this could be done. I mean, do you feel that?
Yeah, very, very much. I mean, Nigeria and South Africa are, relatively speaking, the sort of powerhouse continents where books and writing are concerned. But it's still fairly stunted in relation to other places. But almost every young African writer that I've worked with, and I have encountered a few over the years, wants to leave Africa. They're all trying to establish themselves here. And very often, I mean, a lot of those books that did win prizes last year are being written from Europe or America, looking back at Africa. And that in itself is problematic, I think. I mean, you in a sense need to be in the belly of the beast in order to speak through its mouth. So,
is that something that you deliberately didn't do, that you didn't seek exile, and that you didn't want to peer back into your country from London or from here?
Well, I have always had a fear, I guess, that exile would cut me off creatively from everything that mattered. So yeah, I know, Ireland has a rich tradition
of exile.
Yes, writing from exile, and marvelous books too. So perhaps this fear is unfounded. But yeah, it's always felt to me that I need to be where it's happening.
Right.
There's something else which I remember growing up reading all sorts of European novels, as we talked about, and very often there was a kind of assumption that you would know things about Europe or whatever. I mean, they would have a French passage or a French phrase, and the presumption, I guess, is that you speak French, even if you're English. And I didn't speak French. I didn't know these things. So there was a sense of like trying to come to grips with something foreign, but through context or research or whatever it is, you more or less understand what's being presented to you. And I thought with this book, I mean, there is a thing with South African writing that if you want to be published abroad, you have to translate yourself. And I don't mean just language-wise, but that you have to make clear what our local expressions mean, or what a particular habit or approach might be in South Africa that doesn't make sense elsewhere. And with this book, part of me kind of defiantly thought, to hell with that.
Yeah, that's one of the marvelous things that we didn't talk about in the book, where you don't explain words, that it's taken as normal how all these people live and how they speak, without constant business of, that the audience will be an outsider.
Right.
So even though you say it isn't available widely, because of the price, but it is a sense that it is written for the local, for people in your own country to read.
I decided to pretend that for the duration of this book, South Africa is actually the center of the world, and everywhere else is marginal.
And it shows. It's a very it's
in a sense, it does compel people to make the leap of understanding, and in fact, readers have.
Yeah.
So I think this fear or inhibition, whatever it is around the thing of conveying South African meaning more broadly, is perhaps a form of cultural cringe, really, that the center of the world is, it's in England and we have to show deference to England. Well, again, to hell with that.
Now, do we have questions from Zoom? No. And do we have any other questions? Yeah.
This is the last one.
Thank you.
It's been great. I've not read your novel yet. I'm looking forward to it. The way you describe the structure of kind of discrete sections separated in time reminds me of a couple of my favorite novels, like Don DeLillo's Underworld and Alan Hollinghurst's, pretty much everything he's done recently. And I'm just curious how you think about that as you write it. I think the power of those books are the resonance in time of between those sections is kind of integral to how those novels work. And I don't know if you relate to that, but how do you think about the planning and the structuring of that of your book when you are jumping in kind of discrete sections like that? Are you kind of rhyming between the sections as you write them and finding kind of commonality between those?
As I say, the structure was the first thing to sort of seize my imagination, but it's a big thing, and in fact, it's a great help. If you don't have a sense of the structure of something, if you just have a sense of the narrative, you sort of have to find a form for it that will work. And very very often novelists get themselves into trouble in the sense of overwriting terribly. Whereas if you have a very firm sense of structure when you begin, you also have a very firm sense of what might not be relevant. Because it's all about information, what information you give, when you give it, and what you leave out. So it's a bit of a delicate dance. I will say first drafts are a lot longer and baggier than the book ends up eventually. There's great pleasure in cutting stuff and giving it its edge and its shape. As an extension of that, I guess, with this particular book, I first thought of the 4 funerals, and I thought, yeah, that's great. There's these big jumps in time, and the reader will have to imaginatively fill them in. And it sort of came as a secondary concern that if I just widened the frame a little bit and showed a little bit of South Africa in the background, that there'd be a similar jump. So I'm pointing that out because not the whole idea doesn't ever arrive once sort of fully formed. You think, okay, I can tell this part of the story, and then by extension, if you sit with it a while, you think, well, that other theme I wanted to work with, that could also take shape around the structure that I've decided. So you cumulatively build up a book, or at least I do. It doesn't sort of arrive in a blinding flash the way it seems to in lots of movies. It's a far more granular, gritty and slow process for me. Colm, I'm sure, has lots to say on.
No, nothing. No, that's what I would say. What you just said. So thank you very much for the question, and thanks for coming, and thanks to Damon. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Colm.